All right. We are live. It is a special edition of Coffee Break Live. We are coffee break early in the morning today. Me, John Haney, and Kelf are here, and we're going to be talking about defining good and evil in D&D. If there's anyone out there in the chat, give us a quick message. Let me know that you can hear us. Okay, let us know that you can hear our mics, but I think we're good to go, and I think we are good to get started. I'm not sure if there's going to be very many people tuning in. This is not my usual go live time, but we'll see how it goes. And at any rate, we will get the recording of it up. Waz is in here. Dungeons of 20s is in here. How's it going, William? I hear you as well, or you hear me. I see that you hear me, which is good. Dirty Socks in here. Heck yeah. Okay, they can hear us. All right. Thank you all for joining us, and I'm pretty excited about this conversation. So, defining good and evil in D&D, I believe that this is a fun opportunity to talk about a little bit of philosophy, a little bit of like morality and how it plays into our tabletop role-playing games. I do feel that playing tabletop role-playing games can be a way to kind of look at a mirror about how we live and how we think in real life. It can also be a really good playground for experimenting with our beliefs, experimenting with the things that we think are true or false, experimenting with our perceptions of the world. And so we're going to dive into it. We're going to get a little philosophical here, and we're going to go through a couple of the alignment systems. We've got the 5e alignment system. John brought the Shadow Dark alignment system, and then we're going to definitely talk about basically a topic that I brought to the table, which is can in-game good and evil be objectively measured and quantified? And if so, how do we do it? And so we're gonna get the great minds of the century together here, and we're gonna answer the question.
Where is that?
It's a good thing that John and Kelf are here.
There's more guests. I didn't know.
I didn't know we had someone coming.
All right, so maybe a great way to start would be for each one of us to kind of go around and kind of just give a small, quick intro on what we believe the truth is about this topic. Just kind of like what we expect to talk about and expect to kind of make our case for. And I'll kind of start. And I here's what I think. I think that when we look at it really closely, we can objectively measure good and evil based on the concepts of like selfishness versus like altruism. I really believe that there's a good case to be made for those things in measuring it. And that's kind of where I see myself going in this conversation and kind of leaning into. And I'm also interested in bouncing those concepts off of you guys and maybe getting challenged on it, because I'll admit I haven't done like a deep thought about that. That's like the direction my thinking's heading in. Definitely open to hearing what other people think about that. Let's go on to John. John, what do you think? What's your opening kind of?
All right. Good versus evil is an interesting one. I think a lot of people in D&D today have a problem defining good and evil because they have a problem defining good and evil in real life. And they're like, well, what is good? What is evil? Is morality even objective or subjective? I mean, personally, my personal beliefs, and with all due respect, I believe morality is absolute. It is that there is real good and there is real evil. So we get back to the point of why do we play D&D? We're telling a story. Why do we tell stories? To teach lessons. And therefore, the lessons that we teach through playing D&D together are meant to, like you were saying, they are meant to challenge our beliefs. They are meant to experiment with thought processes. They are meant to do those things. And so I think as far as morality, we talk about good versus evil. There's also law versus chaos. I might bring that in just a little bit as well. And that's actually how the Shadow Dark system we'll look at a little bit later defines it. So yeah, I believe it is objective, and I believe it is important because that gets to the whole reason why we play. I mean, if you have a beer and pretzels game and you're just wanting to kill monsters, maybe not so much. But if you're really the way the game was intended, telling a story, then what story are we telling? Why are we telling it? What are the themes? And I think good and evil does come into that. Our personal beliefs come into that. And when you're playing with people, maybe who don't all necessarily agree on, say, religion or politics or in-world ethics in every area, that's a good way to challenge that. But I think the way we define it in game, especially as game masters, really sets the tone for how that's going to go. So yeah, I'm looking forward to getting into it.
All right. How about you, Kalf? What are your introductory statements?
I legitimately think that for the longest time, D&D and I don't do a whole lot with a lot of other TTRPGs. I play a little bit of Pathfinder, but I legitimately think that it has struggled with defining whether or not like law or good and evil or law and chaos is a descriptive aspect or a prescriptive aspect. Is an evil monster evil because of the things that they do, or do they do evil things because they are evil? And it's and I know in the 14th 2020 or 2014 version of the player's handbook, it really goes into saying like these are hard line factors, but in the 2024 version they are trying to kind of wipe a little bit of that away. I've played a lot with like moral fluidity in a lot of my games, and have avoided using alignment in recent years. So I'm definitely one of the ones that is kind of getting away from it, because instead of having players especially ascribe to certain alignments, I prefer when it is more of a dynamic, a dynamic kind of playing field that they're looking at.
That's actually very insightful stuff, especially descriptive versus prescriptive, which I think is very relevant to actually the process of playing a TTRPG for many, many reasons. But okay. So let's dive into, we've mentioned these books, how do the player's handbook find it? And when you said the 2014 version went more in depth, that's interesting because the 2024 version is relatively light. Okay, John, is the 2024 version ready? I'm going to actually look up the 3rd edition version because it also went a little bit different. But John, would you give us what the 2024 handbook says? And we'll just maybe go through each of these. Just
2014. So lawful good creatures can be counted on to do the right thing as expected by society. And interestingly, it actually gives creatures that are aligned with this. It says gold dragons, paladins, and most dwarves are lawful good. Neutral good folks do the best they can to help others. Celestials, cloud giants, and gnomes tend to be neutral good. Chaotic good act on their conscience with little regard to what others expect. So you're starting to see that, like what you were saying, how good versus evil is selfless versus selfish. Kind of that's very much the way 2014 is looking at it here. Whereas evil, if we go to the other end of the spectrum, lawful evil creatures methodically take what they want within the limits of the code of a tradition of loyalty or of order. So devils, blue dragons, and hobgoblins tend to be lawful evil. A certain Minotaur bard that I've heard of that plays by the name of Grom, fits that description almost perfectly, methodically taking what they want within the limits of a code. And then flipping over to like chaotic evil. Chaotic evil creatures act with arbitrary violence spurred by their greed, hatred, or bloodlust. So this is very much aligning with what you said about good versus evil being measured by a selfish versus a selfless act. And even in neutrality, they would say a true neutral character is somebody who prefers to steer clear of moral questions and they don't take sides, and they do what at the time seems best. So they're like that actual middle ground. This is the kind of person like I'm staying out of this one, guys. It's the guy who backs out of the room whenever conversations get deep. So that's kind of the way neutral is. So that's how 2014 defines it, and I think that's a really solid definition for the way most games tend to run.
Now, the 2024 version does whitewash that a little bit in terms of actually defining it. So in 2024, it says when we're talking about the 9 alignments on page 39, a creature's alignment broadly describes its ethical attitudes and ideals. Alignment is a combination of 2 factors. One identifies morality, good, evil, or neutral, and the other describes attitudes toward order, lawful, chaotic, or neutral. And then here's some summaries. Lawful good says, lawful good creatures endeavor to do the right thing as expected by society. So it's almost saying the right thing is what society expects them to do, right? That it looks like they immediately quantify it with that. And then someone who fights injustice and protects the innocent without hesitation is probably lawful good. That's all it says about lawful good.
And I want to point out in the 2024 one, it gives examples for each one, but it specifically states probably at the end of every single one, because it's not putting that hard line on this is an example of X, this is an example of Y. It's saying it's probably.
Yeah. And then when we go to, like, for example, let's say lawful evil. Lawful evil creatures methodically take what they want within the limits of a code of tradition, loyalty, or order. An aristocrat exploiting citizens while scheming for power is probably lawful evil. Now, one thing I think is interesting is when we go to chaotic evil, I believe that the chaotic evil definition, I would say, is actually, I don't know, I might be a little bit even more off to me, but it says chaotic evil creatures act with arbitrary violence, spurred by their hatred or bloodlust. A villain pursuing schemes of vengeance and havoc is probably chaotic evil. Versus chaotic good, which says chaotic good creatures act as their conscience directs with little regard for what others expect. A rebel who waylays a cool baron's tax collectors and uses the stolen money to help the poor is probably chaotic good, which is like the classic Robin Hood example, right? But like, so this is interesting though. Chaotic good creatures act as their conscience directs. It's like that's describing how you measure good. If your conscience directs you there, it sounds like how it's defining it, right? But to me, how is that any different than the chaotic evil? They just spelled it differently.
Yep.
Like, to me, that's what it comes across as. Okay, so that's what the 2024 says. Now, I wanted to read a little bit of the 3rd edition Player's Handbook definition, which is interesting. And I'm gonna just to combine, I'm gonna look at the lawful good again. It says lawful good, crusader. A lawful good character acts, and once again, this is for those at home, this is the 3rd edition.
Oh man, I missed that artwork from high school.
Yes, it was good artwork, actually. A lawful good character acts as a good person is expected or required to act. She combines a commitment to oppose evil with the discipline to fight relentlessly. She tells the truth, keeps her word, helps those in need, and speaks out against injustice. A lawful good character hates to see the guilty go unpunished. Alhandra, a paladin who fights evil without mercy and who protects the innocent without hesitation, is lawful good. Lawful good is the best alignment you can be because it combines honor and compassion. All of the alignments in this Giva, this is the best one. Versus, now I'm going to read the chaotic evil, or actually, I'm sorry, I'm going to read the lawful evil just to, to compare the two. Lawful evil, dominator. A lawful evil villain methodically takes what he wants within the limits of his code of conduct without regard to whom it hurts. He cares about tradition, loyalty, and order, but not about freedom, dignity, or life. He plays by the rules, but without mercy or compassion. He is comfortable in a hierarchy and would like to rule, but he is willing to serve. He condemns others not according to their actions, but according to race, religion, homeland, or social rank. He is loath to break laws or promises. This reluctance is partly because of his nature and partly because he depends on order to protect himself from those who oppose him on moral grounds. Some lawful evil villains have particular taboos, such as not killing in cold blood, but having underlings do it, or not letting the children come to harm if it can be helped. They imagine that these compunctions put them above unprincipled villains. The scheming baron who expands his power and exploits his people is lawful evil. Lawful evil is the most dangerous alignment because it represents methodical, intentional, and frequently successful evil. Lawful evil is sometimes called diabolical because devils are the epitome of lawful evil. So the third edition goes way more in depth on alignments, and I think that they actually give what we could call some more concrete. They like place more concrete definitional framework on those concepts, I think, which is interesting. It's interesting that as the books have progressed, they have really pared down the defining descriptive elements of good and evil, and it has really become much thinner. I'm not necessarily saying that as a criticism of the books, but I do notice it's happening, and I feel like it's maybe worth discussing. And I think that it also, when it's done that way, it maybe takes away from the conversations people might have about good and evil when they sit down to play the game. And so in that sense, I kind of wish it was continual. Like, I wish they continued to expand on it a little bit in the newer versions like they did in the older versions. Okay, with that being said, let's open up the floor to some points of discussion. And I have a point of discussion I'd like to pursue, and I've kind of shared that at the beginning, but I'm also down to pursue whatever points of conversation John or Kelf you might have. Let's start with you, John. Where would you like to take us next?
I found it really interesting. Was that actually in the book that it said, the third edition book, that it said that lawful good is the best alignment?
Yeah. So
that's interesting.
So
it's even saying that law is good, and they're like aligning that's really interesting.
Well,
too,
they do say that about several of them. For example, chaotic good. They say chaotic good is the best alignment you can be because it combines a good heart with a free spirit. And then
sure.
With lawful neutral, it says lawful neutral is the best alignment you can be because it means you are reliable and honorable without being a zealot.
Okay, so sure. Okay. Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, that is an interesting thing. And just a talking point is that interesting. I don't have AD&D or second edition on hand, but even just having that third to fifth edition and just seeing how much shorter the paragraphs got between third and fifth edition is almost evidence of, like what I was saying earlier, society as a whole in the last 25 years has really come to wrestle with, well, what is good versus evil? And you can almost sense Wizards of the Coast being like, okay, let's not take such a hard line on this, and let's kind of back off and let each individual table kind of define good and evil for themselves. We'll give them a little definition. We'll make it a little more innocuous. Let's just say, okay, well, if you're selfish, then you're evil. And if you're selfless, then you're good. But other than that, there were whole examples. There were a lot more descriptors in that third edition one versus the fifth edition. And that idea, is sort of evidencing that idea of like, well, we play these games to teach ourselves lessons, but people in general, society as a whole, is kind of wrestling with this. Well, what is good? What is evil? Let's go back to our most basic definitions, and try not to offend anybody with what good and evil actually are. So that was something that was really interesting there, to me, that kind of like, well, let's back off on that. um, and yeah, the idea that law and chaos is kind of part of this too. And they're both on these slider bars, and we tend to put it, like, good, evil, law, chaos, or whatever direction my screen is. But we have this thing, and law versus chaos, to me, is something that can be observed. This is external behavior. Whereas good versus evil is more internal. This is motives. And I like what, Lucas, what you were saying as far as descriptive versus prescriptive. I think law versus chaos, you can very clearly define, oh, that character is chaotic. They're acting on impulse rather than according to a code. Or that character is lawful. They're adhering to the tenets of their god, or even, pirate code or whatever. They're adhering to that code. Versus good versus evil seems very much to be something, but like in that character's interior. That's something that, like, well, okay, well, were you being selfish when you did that, or did you have a selfless motive? Two people might give a gold coin to a poor person. One person might give the gold coin truly out of a desire to benefit the poor person, but the other person giving a gold coin to the poor person might be doing so just because they know somebody else is watching, and they're going to get a favor for it later. They're going to get recognized for it. And so they both might have done, the same thing, but one was being selfish and one was being selfless. And I think that's an interesting thing, especially talking about, well, then how do we quantify that? How do we assign that in a D&D game? So.
Very good. Kelf, let's go. Let's take it to you. What would you like to say to that, or just in general, what would you, let's give you the floor.
I mean, yeah, I definitely agree that older editions have had a little bit more of a hardline stance on, what is and isn't lawful, chaotic, good, or evil. I mean, even in past editions, you had books and magic items that you had to be good or you had to be evil to use it, and if you were of a different alignment, you would take damage if you tried to interact with it. Or even even in the first editions, if you wanted to play a paladin, you had to be a good character, and there were very specific ways that they determined that. And I think with Wizards wanting to move to something that was more approachable by a grander audience and by a wider audience, it's exactly as you said. They didn't want to take these hardline stances and draw a line in the sand and say this is X and this is Y. And that's why they have stuff in the new player's handbook where it's all probablys. It's I mean, even arguably in the 2014 version, they sometimes say it's typical. It's common to see this.
Most dwarves.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that is arguable to say. Most orcs are going to be chaotic. They're going to be wild and crazy, and then you question, okay, what makes them that way? Or looking at devils and demons, for example. I mean, that's in my opinion, the perfect example of law chaos. Devils live by a code. They have laws, they have hierarchy, they have structure within their societies, and they uphold to that. I mean, that's why they talk about devils making contracts with people. And then you have the demons where it's more chaotic, it's crazy. And even looking at the monster designs between those, devils often have a have a little bit more of a clean look to them. They are not obviously looking like, fluffy and happy and stuff like that, but
Yeah.
the devil, or I mean the demons look very like rough and chaotic just in their designs a lot of time. So it's a lot easier, just like John said, it's a lot easier to see chaos in law in action. But when it comes to good and evil, it's so much more subjective, because it is an internal thing. It's harder to describe, in my opinion, good and evil in a concrete aspect. I mean, you can say that, is it the difference between altruism and selfishness? If I'm going out of my way to do stuff for other people without an expectation of getting anything back, like John said, or like influencers we see today, posting videos on YouTube where it's like, I'm giving $20 to a homeless person and they got their friends videotaping from the bushes. So, you're going to post this. Did you do good to this person? Or are you doing it, with the expectation of a reward or a pat on the back of some kind? Or, is a paladin hunting down necromancers good in your game? Necromancy is often looked at as a profane art that's inherently evil. But to a society where necromancy is just simply a tool and isn't inherently evil, that paladin is the evil one. And kind of the last point that I'll say, and I often have iterated, or not iterated, I've often mentioned this to my players in my games. Everyone is the hero in their own story. Every adventurer who's out there is not necessarily going out saying, I want to be evil, I want to do, terrible things, but they simply are in a perspective where what they're doing is justified. Thanos in his own mind was justified for what he was doing.
Yeah.
So was it evil in a wide realm? Sure, he killed half the universe. He wiped them from existence. But in his mind, he saw that the world was running low on resources and that everybody would eventually die. So he was trying to even the playing field and make it fair. But the flaw in those villains is the fact that they don't look past those initial thoughts of, should I wipe out half the universe or should I double all the resources? So I think it's a lot harder to actually define good and evil.
Yeah. You said something that really reminded me of something here in the 5th edition handbook. It talks about alignment in the multiverse. It says, for many thinking creatures, alignment is a moral choice. And it would talk about, it says here that the last sentence in this section says, sharks are savage predators, for example, but they're not evil. They're not choosing that. It says, so like creatures that lack that moral thought capacity are not good or evil. They're unaligned, completely unaligned.
Yep.
But it says that like for celestials and fiends, that's an inherent part of their nature. It says if a devil ceases to be lawful evil, it also ceases to be a devil.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting thing. So where are we going now with races like the Aasimar or the Tieflings? If you are truly of infernal parentage, then that is part of your essence. Do you cease to be a tiefling if you choose to be good?
Right.
Or do you cease to be, do you cease to be an Aasimar if you choose to be evil? That's an interesting question there. So yeah, it really is that moral choice that sort of defines good versus evil. But how do we quantify that? That's an interesting one.
I also like the fact that it does, like you said, it says if it ceases to be lawful evil, it ceases to be a devil. So that in the 2014 book, it is prescriptive. It is not the actions of the devil that make it lawful evil. It is by the inherent essence that it is a devil that its actions are then lawful evil, that it is going to do lawful evil things simply for the fact that it exists. And that kind of puts a lot of pressure into alignment when you're saying, okay, is there such thing as free will at that point?
Mhm.
You know,
It does speak to the orcs, though. Example, it says like the orcs were created by Grumsh,
Yep.
who is chaotic evil, and it says now an orc, yeah, right. And it says an orc can choose to be lawful good, but because it racially was created
yeah,
by a chaotic evil deity, it will struggle against its internal nature. So an orc, a mortal race, it says, does have choice. A mortal race does have free will, but it will still struggle against nature, which is interesting.
Yeah.
That's a very like almost Judeo-Christian in nature. That idea that human beings, we're fallen creatures, but we have a choice. We can choose right or wrong actions and right or wrong motives. So that's an interesting thing. I feel like the fifth edition book kind of like it touches on it, but it runs away before it offends anybody. You know,
it definitely gets close, and then and especially in the 2024 version, it's just such a surface level, and and honestly, I'm okay with like anymore. I'm okay with that because I feel like alignment played a bigger roles in the past, but especially when it comes to player characters, I just very much lean more towards, build a personality for your character. Let me know what are their ideals, what do they want, what are their goals. Like I want to see from your words what it is your character wants, and then I want to see their actions. And I want to see what choices you make as this character. And that is going to give me so much more than just you picking one of nine ascribing words and saying, okay, this is what I am, and this is what I'm going to be. And anytime that a situation comes up and I have my 9 options at the bottom of the screen, I'm going to click CN. I'm chaotic neutral, so I'm going to do whatever makes me feel fun and keeps my freedoms my own. And it's like, okay, so even if it goes against the entire party and does not benefit you, you're still going to go that because your alignment is. And that's why I don't like it. I think in a lot of ways, and why I moved away from a lot of alignment stuff is this. I think it's supposed to be more of a narrative tool and not a strict role. It should help define a character's motivations and not be a straitjacket.
Yeah, I teach high school literature for a living. Dynamic characters are always the protagonists.
Yeah.
Your characters, your party, they are the protagonists. They should be dynamic. Maybe you started as chaotic neutral, but you are shifting towards a true neutral or a neutral good, or maybe you're shifting towards lawful evil. Maybe, like you can shift, you can change, and I think you should. Which once again gets back to Josh's point, like what is the how do we quantify this? How do we measure that? In order to narratively kind of speak, is this a merely narrative tool, or can we track it? Can we give benefits like that? I try to in my games. I have a character who is he's a lawful good fighter. But, as he does more and more lawful good things, I'm almost thinking like, am I just going to give him a level of cleric, maybe? Like, just give it to him because he's doing so many lawful good things. I'm like, his deity would see that. His deity would empower that. His deity would or maybe a level of paladin or something, as a fighter, he doesn't get much from one level of paladin, but, but a level of cleric he would. So that's something where like, how could I track that? How could I see that? I've heard of other games that have morality trackers. I'm not remembering which ones now. Was it Easy D6 or possibly it was some third party game or something that have morality trackers. that I find fascinating. It's not in D&D, it's not in Shadow Dark. But Shadow Dark does have cool things to say about deities. Right, it's right with the alignment stuff, which if we want to touch on that, but it says priests must choose one god to serve faithfully. Whereas I've heard, like, even in D&D 5e in 2024, people are like, can you be a cleric that's atheist? And people are like, sure, why not? And I'm like, no, you're destroying the core fantasy of the class. It says a priest's deity can revoke the gift of spellcasting if the priest commits blasphemous acts. And so then I'm thinking, who is the deity? Who's defining blasphemous acts? That's the GM. So I think as GMs, we have to wrestle with good and evil, or law and chaos. We almost, if that's the kind of game you're playing, if that's not your table, whatever. But if you're truly looking to seek to emulate the epic tales of the past, if you're truly seeking to imitate fables, fairy tales, and myth, if you're seeking to imitate those things, the categories of old folk tales, the oldest stories that we've been telling each other since the beginning of time are folk tales. And folk tales seek to teach a lesson, whether that's a good versus evil, whether that's a simple day-to-day moral lesson. What are those lessons that we're trying to teach? Now, we're teaching them to each other because we're the GMs. The characters all have a voice too. The players all have a voice. So we're all going there. But is there a way we can track it? So I'm not sure what system it was I was doing. I saw it on a video once.
Yeah, I just tried looking it up because I have the EZD6 handbook, and didn't see anything at least just quick glance about morality.
But it's a fascinating thing to talk about. Can we all start? Could we possibly add something to our character sheets where we say, here's your morality tracker. Are you following the tenets of society? Are you tending towards law or chaos?
Right.
Are you doing good or evil things? And that's really counts on the player to be honest. Is your character doing this for selfish or selfless reasons?
Sure.
I have a thought about that, and it comes to this question of deities. And so I think that, so there's been a couple people in the chat who have mentioned Christianity, and then John, you mentioned Christian values. And so this is interesting. So it's like, if we believe in a deity, then we would fall back to that deity's standards to find our moral blueprint, the baseline of our moral blueprint, right? So it's like we're deferring to a higher power, the power that decides these things. Now in D&D, which is a very pluralist system, usually there are many gods and goddesses. So I think it makes sense, and this is how I actually treat it in my games. Every god or goddess is going to have their own version of what it means to do good or to do evil, and even their own methodologies. For example, Hieronius is very much you help the poor, you protect the weak, you be a steward for the innocent, you safeguard the churches, make sure evil does not encroach upon our borders, like a very, like, what I would call stereotypically good type things. But that's different than a god like so Corellin Larethian is chaotic good, the god of the elves. And I've always kind of more role played Corellin Larethian being more like, good is like, okay, yes, do good. Doing good for the elves is a little better than doing good for the humans, though. Like, if you're going to do good, doing good for them is going to get you way more points with me. It's like, oh, you're a human, you worship me. How good are you to the elves? Because they're my chosen race, right? So it's like, so there's this subjective stuff. And then the same thing is true. Like, evil is different. Groomsh's evil is different than Neyrul's evil. For Neyrul, it's like, I want to see what kind of evil you can concoct just for evil's sake. Whereas Groomsh is more like cause chaos and dominate your enemies. Like, that's his brand, right? So it's like, I kind of think that in D&D, and John, this comes back to what you were saying about clerics and priests. Yeah. I also believe that clerics and priests is like, how do we track morality? And this kind of comes around to the idea of a morality tracker. I always track morality for characters, and I don't have like a tracker per se, but I always track it in the moment, like how good or bad is their standing with their god based on how are their actions aligning with their chosen deities description of what it means to be a quote unquote good or quote unquote bad, which is actually very varied and different, I would say, between them, which is a little bit of a cop out if we're actually trying to objectively define good and evil, because we are actually falling back to what the gods think. And then there's a deeper question: which god is more actually accurate about their good and evil? But it's like, well, is that for me to decide? I'm merely the humble GM. I'm just running the game. Like,
is there an objective good? Is there one good above all in the universe?
Well, so that's an interesting one too. So I had written down here in my notes the Anakin clause, and I'm thinking of the very specific line in the third Star Wars, don't demonetize, where Anakin says, from my point of view, the Jedi are evil. And that's like such a profound line. And I love Star Wars and the epic fantasy. That's a hill I will fight on. I won't die on it, but I'll fight on it. That Star Wars is not sci-fi; it's fantasy. Space wizards. Come on. But he says, from my point of view, the Jedi are evil, and we never get to hear him out. I'm not saying he's right, but we never get to hear him out. And so then I'm thinking, okay, so are the Sith, they have their code, and the Jedi have their code. These two codes are opposed to each other. But Anakin points out, from my point of view, I am doing the right thing, and you are evil, to Obi-Wan, and that they're in that moment. And so then I question, okay, so D&D generally categorizes Lulth as evil, lawful evil. But then I'm thinking, okay, but according to her, the Drow are doing the right thing. They're doing all these, they're working their way through society and the rungs of society, and they're backstabbing, and they're doing, and Lulth wants that. Those are the tenets of Lulth. So then as far as tracking morality, if we're getting to the point of, well, who defines morality? It's your deity. Shadow Dark talks about that. Priests must choose a deity. Not every character must, but priests must. Priests have to choose a deity. And now we have to say, okay, well, because the GM acting as that deity can depower a priest. And that was the thing in older editions as well. You don't see it in 5th edition at all. I think maybe it was touched on in 3rd. I'm not remembering. That was high school. That was a lifetime ago. But the idea that your deity defines good and evil, and in D&D, where unless you play a very atypical D&D game, it is pluralistic. There are multiple deities. And who, is there a, one true god and a bunch of lesser gods? Or is it more like the Greek or Norse pantheons, where there is a king god, but the other gods are still fully gods? Or, is it truly a free-for-all? And then at that point, so I was thinking about this. This is an interesting thought that I had. Maybe 5e got it right, because in almost every fantasy world that I've encountered, what makes a god a god? What makes a god a god? What is that core essence beyond being immortal and super powerful and having a realm that they govern and everything? It's the fact that they gave of themselves to empower or to create others. I mean, you see it in Middle Earth. You see it in the Elder Scrolls world. The gods, the Aedra, gave of themselves to create Mundus. You see it in Narnia. You see it in all these different fantasy realms. The gods are the gods because they're giving of themselves to their followers or to their creations. Which then, interestingly enough, is kind of what 5e describes, that good is altruistic and selfless. It gives selflessly, and evil is selfish. So that's like a really interesting thing. In a pluralistic sense, Morality truly is about altruism or selfless versus selfish, self-absorbed, arrogant. And that's like that was profound. As I was kind of like thinking about it when Josh, you gave me the topic a few days ago, I was like mulling it over, doing the shower philosophy thing, and I was like, wow, did 5e actually kind of get it right? That idea of selfish versus selfless kind of gets around to that. But then the good versus evil within that, what does your deity say? Are you following the tenets of your deity in order to, especially if you're a priest or a cleric or paladin or something like that, then are you being powered by a deity? If you commit too many acts that go against the tenets, can you be depowered entirely?
So, okay, so I think that on your last question there, if you fail to uphold the tenets, do you get depowered? In D&D, I mean, back in third edition, if you were first of all, there was no such thing as an evil paladin. A paladin had to be lawful good, actually. If a paladin strayed from the lawful good alignment, it literally said in the rule book, you lose your paladin abilities. You become basically an empty fighter. You become a fighter without the benefits.
Yeah, worst fighter.
Yeah. And in my games, I've had warlocks break from their patrons and spend a long amount of time as a spellcaster with no spells, basically.
Yeah.
Like as they were looking for a new patron, which I think so. I think that this is accurate with the fantasy, not only like the tropes of fantasy, but I also think that it makes just genuine sense, unless they're a sorcerer. Like that's what makes a sorcerer, though. They don't get their power really from the gods. Clerics get their power from the gods, and so do paladins. Now, with that being said, I would like to pose a question to you two.
Yeah.
There are a range of gods in D&D. There are good gods, there are evil gods, neutral gods, etc. But we've kicked around this idea, which I kind of kicked this around, I think, I probably kicked this around more than anyone, maybe, that altruism leads us to good and selfishness leads us to evil. Like that's kind of where the fork in the road begins. With that being said, it's also true that it becomes so blurry. So, for example, it's like, well, if I am in a survival situation, right, and I selfishly kill the animal so that I can eat it and survive, is that actually selfish? By preserving our life, are we not indulging in a very selfish centered act, just at a very low, maybe below the filter level? And so at what point does the filter kick in, where, like, if we were truly selfless, then you might think, okay, if we're taking it to an extreme, we would just stop consuming all the water and food so other people could have them, and then we would die within like 36 hours. Like we would just cease to exist. Which leads to another question of, are good gods actually good? Can you actually become a powerful deity being truly benevolent, or was there an element of self-preservation and self-uplifting at work, which is kind of inherently selfish? And so I guess the question that I want to pose to you guys is, while I actually do think that this altruism and selfishness idea is probably the best thing we have to measure objectively the presence of evil or good, it does seem to me that it can't be a perfect system, and we almost have to put a filter somewhere between, like, we can't start measuring until after the basic level of self-preservation has taken place. So it's like, first you have self-preservation, which is benign and neutral morally. Then anything beyond that, you have a choice of whether to act selflessly or to act selfishly. And that's when we begin to measure good and evil. And then, so it's almost something like that, which is kind of difficult to quantify. I want to pose that to you guys. What do you think about that?
I mean, I think that's an interesting way to look at it. I mean, it's kind of like saying, if you're not having to fight for survival and resources, what choices are you making? And that's a very interesting way to kind of see it, because it is, when a hunter goes out and kills a deer so he can feed his family, he's not, in his mind, he's good and he's justified and he's right in what he's doing. But from the perspective of the deer, or the deer's, the fawns, not the fawns, the fawns, it's an evil act because they've been killed. And so there is a almost kind of an ends justify the means when you are on a baser survival level. And like we mentioned before, beasts in the monster manual are often unaligned because in a sense, when you're not looking at things from like almost like an objective, or not an objective, but like an intelligent morale perspective, and it is just simply survival, there's no way that you can quantify alignment. Again, a shark isn't evil, it's just hungry, it's surviving, it's not doing things out of malevolence. But a shark that is a shark that has eaten, a shark that does not need to eat and does not need to fight or proactively go out and hunt for food, that kills something for no reason, yes, then we start looking into, is this an evil act? I think it was it Jurassic Park, the one with
the Indominus, right?
Yes,
yeah.
Where this dinosaur, they go out into the field and they see all these dead dinosaurs, and it's like none of them are eaten, and it's killing for sport. You can argue that killing for survival, killing a deer to feed your family in an aspect is unaligned, is neutral. You're doing it simply for survival. But then when you start getting into the perspective of you are killing for sport, for the for a sense of enjoyment out of it, and then and regarding that, you start getting into the discussion of like population control and things, and it's very robust conversation to have, and definitely not one that I'm qualified to speak on, not as somebody who doesn't hunt, but in a family of hunters, that has been one of those things that's been discussed. There's a lot of aspects to it, and so I think I think it is very much I think I mentioned it before, like, is a paladin hunting necromancers evil from his from the societal kind of perspective, if society thinks necromancers are okay. So
so that's one. I mean, I do hunt,
okay.
not a lot, but I have hunted before. I hunted to feed my family. That is a good thing. And also, I mean, we're talking real world morality. That's a deer. That is not a moral sapient creature. Now in D&D, is a deer, sentient versus sapient? That's a whole nother argument too. Like, it knows it's alive and it can feel, therefore it's sentient. But is it sapient? Does it
what if instead of a deer, it's a deer tar, right? That makes it
exactly. So then there's the other question. Me hunting a deer versus hunting some other sort of like one of the anthropomorphic animal species. If I hunt a rabbit, that might be okay, but if I hunt a herringon, right? Like that's very different. Now I'm losing the name of the deities, but like certain deities might say, no, the rabbit is okay, but the herringon is not. Other deities might say, hey, look, if it's not an orc, go ahead and kill it. If it's not an elf, even, go ahead and kill it. If it's not anything that you're not, go ahead. Like it's therefore not even a person. It doesn't count. Whereas other deities might go the other direction entirely. Like, no, you shall not kill anything. If it has blood in its veins, you cannot kill it. And some deities might say that. So we get back to the point of, what does our deity say? And that puts pressure on game masters, I feel like, to actually flesh out what are the tenets of the deities. in your world, whether you're using core deities. I don't know that even third edition actually listed tenets for the different deities. And even I mean, like Judeo-Christian, we have the 10 commandments, right? But in our world, maybe even if we just limited to 3, every deity has 3 tenets. Are you following those, or are you breaking those? And so, like, one deity might say these are the tenets, another deity might say these are the tenets. This guy thinks he's good, this guy thinks he's good, and therefore that guy's evil, therefore that guy's evil.
Yep.
And I think each character then needs their own alignment chart, their own tracker of versus, like, who are they serving, what afterlife are they even trying to get to? Are they trying to get to heaven or Valhalla? That's like the show Vikings, like, where are you trying to get?
Yeah.
Which
actually was a really good show. And
Yeah.
that show had a really great discussion about religion.
And Ragnar is constantly dealing with that. It was like, well, Floki is my best friend. Athelstan is my best friend. Athelstan is Christian. He wants to go to heaven. Floki is Viking. He wants to go to Valhalla. Who do I? And Ragnar wrestles with that to the end, to the very end. I didn't watch the last seasons. I watched as long as Ragnar survived. But
it was best when Ragnar was there. After he left, it got a little weird. But okay, so this is an interesting thing. So what you were saying leads me to think, I kind of think of it as like, there's a third metric for alignment that we're not measuring according to alignment, which is how much your actions are pleasing that specific deity. So there's almost like a deity pleasing level. So it's like, okay, are you good or are you evil? Are you lawful or are you chaotic? And then there's the question of, is what you're doing pleasing your God or is it not? That's almost like a third and related but different metric that will be based on the God, because you could be doing exactly what Hieronymus wants you to do, and it would make Nerul furious. He would be like, you could have killed all those people. How dare you just throw away that opportunity for that mass slaughter that you could have had? That would have been so entertaining. That would have been so pleasing. It's like, you are a terrible follower, whereas for Hieronymus, it'd be like, you protected these souls, good for you. This pleases me. So anyway, that's just a thought to throw in there, is that maybe a third resource measurement is in order.
So I was thinking about that one, and I was almost like, okay, is law versus chaos, your code? For some characters, that might be a religious code. For your paladins, your monks, your priests or clerics, or whatever your system calls them, I feel like that is your code is whatever your God says it is. For other characters, that code might be, Pirates of the Caribbean. That's pirate code, which has nothing to do with religion whatsoever. So it could be different. It could be whatever your society says. You might have a completely non-religious society. They still have codes, because you can't have the complete mob rule. You have to have some rules. So therefore, there's that. But it's whatever code. That's law versus chaos.
That's true. That is true.
So it could be religious and it might be societal. How lawful are you? Now, what about when those codes come into conflict? What about when your drow enters, human society, and in Waterdeep or whatever, and the drow is like, well, this is my moral code. Waterdeep's moral code is completely different. Is the drow suddenly chaotic, or is the drow still lawful, but the code is in conflict with Waterdeep's?
That is a really good question.
I think that's a table per table thing.
Well, it's almost a character by character thing, because it's so deep and personal to the character in a way, and it opens up really great storytelling opportunities.
Absolutely.
Which I think is really fun. All right. So let's go around and let's each of us give our final answer to this question. This question being, can in-game good and evil be objectively measured and quantified? And if so, how do you do it in your games? I'll start, and here's basically my thought about it. I do think that good and evil is basically objectively measured really by altruism and selfishness. I really believe that that is, for me, where the line goes. Like, for example, I start to see evil gods going down that selfish road, wanting their followers to do it. Take what you can get. Oppress them if you can. Yeah, kill that person. If you have the chance, why not do it? Exert your power over the universe. Whereas the good, it's like altruism is more like, no, 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 share your food with that poor, lost person, or no, no, use that healing spell to help the orphan. If you find someone lost, help guide them back to civilization. At the very, protect that person from the dinosaur if you can, right? So it's like, so I do think that that's where we start to go. Can it, and then, but I also really do believe from there it starts to really branch off by deity. And I also believe that we cannot escape a subjective element of it. And I think that that subjective element is great for storytelling, which is what we were talking about just now. So, for example, the drow who then comes to human civilization and that clash of cultures, what the drow would have called virtuous for that drow is going to be much different than what the humans would call virtuous. And dealing with that is, we do come into an area that we cannot help but to get subjective about when cultures and societal expectations begin to come in, because those things are subjective based on the views of the culture. And I think that that is the funnest area to play in. Like, I love putting situations in front of players that cause them to have to decide how they're going to handle that. And I think that's so much fun. I think that that's my 2 cents, my concise description. Okay, John, your
Okay. Yeah, I would agree. Especially in a pluralist D&D setting, that altruism versus selfishness really is kind of our overarching. This is the thing. My final takeaway, my approach would be this: both law versus chaos and good versus evil are storytelling tools, and they should be. If that is the kind of game that you're running, where you're really trying to tell a story, you tell stories for a reason. You tell stories because of a theme, because of lessons, and that is important. My 2 cents is law versus chaos falls on the GM. The GM basically acts as the deity. The GM defines what are the tenets of each deity or each society if it's a non-religious character. And the GM can track that because of these are the things that the character is doing. This is very objective. Good versus evil is very much more of a matter of motive. A character can do all the right things, but for all the wrong reasons. A character can even go against the tenets, but for a good reason. So that falls more on the character, in my opinion, and there has to be mutual trust there, because if the GM is going to be trusted to run the law versus chaos slider bar and give rewards and punishments on behalf of the deity or society correctly, which I believe they should, the character then also has to be trusted. Okay, is your character actually tending towards good, or is your character tending towards evil? Did you do this for altruistic reasons? Did you do this for selfish reasons? Are you doing this for neutrality? Are you doing this for practical reasons? Are you doing this for balance in order to keep peace in the party? Where are you falling? And tracking those sliders as a storytelling mechanism, I think, is a very potent thing, especially when you get into character death. Do you get to give that epilogue of, does your character go to, Elysium or the Abyss? Where are you going? Does it matter? Does that exist in your world? I think those are all very potent storytelling elements, and we should use them. But my 2 cents: law versus chaos, that's the GM's realm. Good versus evil, that's the player's realm. And I think those storytelling elements are very potent and should be used if that's the game you want to run.
Very well said. Well said. All right, Kelf, what about you? Final 2 cents. Your official opinion.
So like I said in the beginning, I definitely tend more away from using alignment in most cases, because I don't like how restrictive it can be whenever somebody's trying to think about how they want to play their character. I think if you were to try and come up with some system that could allow you to objectively define what is good and what is evil, and then hold the players to that system, then sure, you definitely can. If you know, and one of the things, I had to find it. I found this a while ago. It was this small table of intent, methods, and impact, to define good and evil. Essentially, the good intent is to act in ways that help protect and uplift others. The methods that you do good is to avoid unnecessary harm, and it values fairness. And the impact that good does is it leaves the world better than it was before, an altruistic kind of perspective. But the intent for evil, as we had mentioned, is to act in self-gain, malice, or destruction. The methods use harm, deceit, and power for control, and the impact leaves the world worse than it was before. So if you can say, are my actions intent to help protect and uplift, and the methods I'm using not causing unnecessary harm, and does it leave the world in a better place, then you could arguably say yes, then that is an objectively good thing. And if it's the opposite, you can say that's an objectively evil thing. Because a paladin who slays a warlord to prevent a massacre is hands down a good character, because the intent is protection, the method is decisive, and the impact is positive. But a warlock who makes a deal for their own gain is, or at somebody else's expense, is evil, because the intent is self-gain, the method is exploitative, and the impact is harmful. So I think there is ways to objectively define good and evil in D&D and at your table. But that has to be a conversation, I feel, because I think John mentioned this. That has to be something that you have at your table. I don't necessarily know if you could come up with some grand universal good, because there's going to be so many morally gray areas no matter what you do, that it has to be something that is per table by table. I mean, arguably you can say cosmologically, like we were mentioning the gods, they have aspects of good and evil. The upper planes tend towards good, the lower planes tend towards evil, and there's chaos and law in between, mixed in with all of those. But if you have a god who's good, who's telling you to go out and kill a bunch of evil cultists, there's a bit of a gray area with that. So yeah, I think my final thought is, yes, you can, but it needs to be something that is set. Those standards are set prior.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I kind of forgot to mention, like, characters can morph, and they should.
Mm-hmm.
That's 100%. Part of the story as well. And I love, like, what you were saying. This is descriptive. This is, it's not like I set it on chaotic neutral, therefore I'm always going to be chaotic neutral. That's awesome. Great talk.
Right. Yeah, great talk. Anyone want to give some closing thoughts? I have a closing thought. John, actually, you said a word, and in your final thoughts, that I think was the only time that's either the only time that's been mentioned in this conversation, or the time that it really got my attention, was the motive. What is the motive? That is such an important element to making a judgment about an action.
Mm-hmm. 100%.
Yeah.
That falls on the character. That's inside.
Yeah.
You look at the corrupt clergy. That the Pharisees in the Bible, they were the best at keeping God's laws. They kept every single one, and yet Christ himself referred to them as dead inside. You're doing all the right things for all the wrong reasons. Mm-hmm. And you are completely selfish. You want to be recognized. You want to be seen. You want to keep your power. You want to do all these things. And he had strong words for that. Externally, extremely lawful, in D&D terms. And yet according to Christ himself, extremely evil because of their motives. That's why, like when I say the law versus chaos, that's GM.
Yeah.
Good versus evil, that has to be what the player says, because that only the player knows that the character's actual motives. So that's super important.
And hopefully the players, and this is an interesting thing too, are deep enough role players. And hopefully they are, because this helps the game. Hopefully they're good enough role players that they can be honest with themselves about what their character is and wrestle with that too, because that's a deep thing.
Player maturity is huge for a good game.
Is. Especially when you start getting into the moral areas and you have that own battle with your own self about it. Because it's almost a game you play with yourself as a character, almost.
Yeah.
But anyway, all of this brings to mind all this talk of the gods and stuff, and then of what you might call the gray, as Kelf did a lot of talking about the gray area of, and there is a lot of gray area. It gets so difficult to slap objective labels onto things at certain points. It brings to mind actually a verse from the Bible, Philippians 2:12. Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence. And then here's the really important part: work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you both to will and to work for his good pleasure. And I love that line: work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. And I feel like my character I'm running right now, lawful evil bard, who might not be evil for much longer because he's kind of on this religious arc. That's what he's doing. Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling.
He went to hell. He went to hell and got religion. Yeah.
Hence the fear and trembling part.
Yeah. And what you do and what you, your motives are very much both very significant. And so, yeah. Yeah, I love that. That is
anyone else?
An apt verse to bring up, and that, understanding that D&D is not a Judeo-Christian world. This is very pluralistic. You have pantheons and all this stuff, but it's still that real world application. We're speaking from our own experience. We tell stories from our own experience, and so I think that's still valid to bring up.
And it's a mirror of the world, and we can use it as a tool to play with those things, which I think is very not only beneficial but therapeutic. In fact, I know that I learn a lot about myself and who I want to be by playing an evil character who does things in the game that I would never actually do in real life. But it's like a simulation, like a play. Anyway, so that concludes my closing thought. Does anyone else have any closing thoughts they'd like to bring up?
Yeah, I think that is an interesting one. Playing a character that's not you. I only for one session, the one shot setting went away, but I played a warlock. This is something I would never do personally. I would never enter a
warlock pact.
Never strike a deal with an entity. My character was a pact of the deep. He had made a deal with a sea hag coven. In order to save his mother. He did it for a good reason. So I still thought of him as a good character, but he did something I would never do. And now he's using those powers, something of a selfish reason, but also a little bit altruistic. So it was very interesting, and it never even came up in the one shot. But as I was writing the character, I was very much getting into all that. And I think that's a really valuable thing to kind of play with that. I can't remember who wrote it, but I've heard of this book called Playing at the World. That's kind of about TTRPGs. That's that idea of we are wrestling with these things in a safe setting, and I think that's why maturity is so important, both as GM and as players, to, not, just go off. If you want to have a fun, zany, whatever, no holds barred kind of game. But yeah, I prefer the kind of games where we can deal with those kinds of things. It's really good discussion as far as what about good and evil and law and chaos and immorality. What makes a person? What makes a deity? Where's the line? Is it nature or nurture? There's all these great questions. So I hope we have more panel discussions to talk about.
Absolutely. I was just about to say, you know what? I don't think anybody has said that particular phrase just yet, but nature versus nurture
Yeah.
is exactly the conversation there. You know, you have a kid, you have somebody growing up who people view as evil. Are they evil because that's just who they are and it's how they act, or is it that it's how they were raised? Is it the society they were brought up in? Is it the situation they had growing up? And it's a factor that plays into it. You know,
Yeah.
it's you have to take all those aspects into play.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, I think that we have done a great job of discussing this topic. I really enjoyed this conversation. Coming up on an hour and 15 minutes, probably a great place to close it out. Thank you all for watching. Thank you for everyone who took part in it. Thanks for all the comments. I really appreciate it. John and Kel, thank you so much for being a part of this. I would love to do this again sometime soon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah,
And for those of you
Thank
who, for those of you in the chat who might want to join us in the Discord, the link is, I'm not actually sure that the link is anywhere right now. And most of my videos, there's a link to the Discord. I'll drop it in the comments after the video's done. But anyway, all right. That's going to close it up. Have a great Saturday, everyone. Roll some D100s for me at your games this weekend. And I will see you all soon.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.